it seems as though one of the things that inspired you and that you're trying to confront, and what you've already said is being your third book on American freedom or liberty, is that you seem to discern that there is a threat to freedom in America today. What threats do you think Americans face to their freedom today?
Well, if we had longer, this is only on one of the two major threats. I would say there are two. And I put the present situation like this in three words: revolution, oligarchy, or homecoming. In other words, revolution is what I'm describing in this book. The radical left, we can get into that and all that it's meant. Oligarchy, you've seen over the last few decades the consolidation and concentration of power, political, bureaucratic, academic, in the media, woke business now, and so on. So just as you've had one-party faculties in many universities, one-party newsrooms, one-party states like California, so the danger is that you will have one-party national politics. And that will be the end not only of the republic, that'll be the end of democracy, properly understood, and the arrival of what the Greeks would call oligarchy, a ruling class hanging on to its own power.
So is the threat necessarily from there just being one party in power, or does it have to do more with the ideas that are being held by a certain party or the other? Because I assume that, because as an example, you said the radical left and one party in California, but there's also a good bit more of one party in Alabama, for example. So would an oligarchy of the other side also be a problem, or does it have to do more with the worldviews and ideas that are behind the parties in power?
Well, it could be either party. And certainly, I live in Washington. You have a certain establishment, doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, you're really more in terms of the maintenance of the present status quo and so on. So no question, it could be either party. But think of the revolution option, and we need to talk about that. That's the content of the book. Mm-hmm. When you see the oligarchy coming closer, in other words, traditional liberalism has been undermined. It had no real basis apart from the scriptures. And as it's become more and more hollow, traditional liberalism has become increasingly oligarchic and therefore open to the radical left. So the greatest danger is the convergence of the radical left and the progressive oligarchy, which would be much more the Democrats than the Republicans. Although you're exactly right, it could be either.
Mm-hmm. And it seems as though this revolution that you're describing is a little bit different than maybe what we would imagine in terms of other revolutions we've seen in other nations, maybe even to a certain extent, the French Revolution, where the revolution was started by the masses and then moved up to take over the reigning power. By pointing and starting with oligarchy, it seems as though you're talking about a revolution that's already taking place within the realms of power and then working its way down into the lower parts of the culture. Is that a right assessment, or am I misunderstanding you?
Let's pick up the big picture. You know, there are 5 major modern revolutions: the English, 1642, the American, 1776, the French, 1789, the Russian, 1917, and the Chinese, 1949. Those are the big ones. The first 2 look different in that one succeeded, the American, and one failed. It's called in England the lost cause. But actually, those 2 are close because they both came out of the Hebrew scriptures through the Reformation. And that's the key thing. Whereas the French, the Russian, and the Chinese are anti-Christian, anti-religious, and anti-clerical, and so on. And so they are essentially secularist with an animosity to all religions. So Solzhenitsyn, for example, said that the Marxist hostility to faith is far deeper than its economics. And we need to recognize that. Now, of course, when we look at the French Revolution, which is the fountain of all the other ones on that side, it only lasted 10 years in France. 1789 to 1799. And Napoleon stepped in as a dictator and said the revolution is over. But while it was over in France, it has been like a volcanic explosion, which has, with its lava flows, flowed out ever since and still flowing. The first great lava flow is not actually what we think of, Karl Marx. It was what's called revolutionary nationalism in France, Italy, Greece, even the rise of secular Zionism. And of course, Hitler was a great admirer of the French Revolution and National Socialism. The second great lava flow is Karl Marx, although it wasn't the 19th century, it was the 20th. So you have revolutionary socialism, which is communism, the Russian and the Chinese revolutions. What we're seeing now, this is the heart of my book, is what I call revolutionary liberationism, sometimes called cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism or even Western Marxism and sometimes user-friendly Marxism. But this is quite different. It's not rooted in economic determinism. It's rooted in cultural dominance. And you go back to thinkers like Antonio Gramsci in the 1920s, living and dying in jail under Mussolini, figuring out why Marx was wrong. And his ideas were picked up by the so-called Frankfurt School from the 20s through to the 60s. And of course, as you know, the key man over here was Herbert Marcuse, who in many ways was the godfather of the New Left. Well, at the end of the 60s, in 67, 68, and this is a very key year, he and a German radical called Rudi Dutschke called for a long march through the institutions. And people need to understand that today because they realize that although I first came here in 68, Martin Luther King assassinated, Senator Robert Kennedy assassinated, 100 American cities were ablaze, far more than last year. But the radicals knew they wouldn't win in the streets. They had to do a long march, incrementally, to win the high schools, colleges, universities, the press and the media, and of course, above all, the culture industry, as they called it, Hollywood and entertainment, and then sweep round, having won the cultural gatekeepers, and then you win the whole culture. So people today are fascinated and alarmed by things like cancel culture or speech codes and things like that, but they actually flow out of the Long March and its triumph over 50 years. They've done it, and we're paying the price. Now, a very key final moment in that progression was in the early 2003, 4, around there, when super funders like George Soros says we could put billions of money now into an ever-swarming, ever-morphing pop-up protest movement, give them different names and so on, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and you could have an incredibly powerful popular movement. That's what they've done. And so in many ways, the republic, let's be clear, is on its last legs. Democracy yet, the republic, that's different. In other words, the biblical restoration, American Revolution notion of ordered freedom. It's on its last legs.